free healthcare services, free ambulance services, all kinds of programs. And they had a school. The Black Panther Party actually started their own school in Oakland, California, where kids could go and get an actual education and not be, getting the public school of the United States. The Black Panther Party, the reason that they were so powerful and the reason that they were a household name was because they engaged in community work. And they really were, at that point, they were the U.S. division of kind of a global movement. At that point, you had the Soviet leaders at that point, you had Khrushchev and I think the early years of like Kosygin and Brezhnev, and they were not really pushing anti-colonial revolts, and China was, and then China stopped around 1969 and was pushing the whole Soviet social imperialism thing. But around the world, you had leaders like Fidel Castro, Kim Il-sung. You had anti-colonial revolts that were taking place all over the world, and the Black Panthers were kind of within the USA. You have a black nation. You have the descendants of slaves who very much consider themselves to be a nation, and have their own neighborhoods and their own churches and their own dialect, and are locked out of U.S. society. And they started engaging in what people all over the developing world were engaging in at that point, and fighting for their rights as a nation. And the Black Panther Party was just the U.S. incarnation of what was going on at that time, which was a global revolt of colonized people in the developing world, of oppressed nations. And I mean, it was everywhere. There was even in Britain, there was even a Welsh uprising. I bet you didn't know that. There was an armed group of Welsh people that were fighting for the independence of Wales. Right? There was the IRA that was happening in Ireland, and the Provisional IRA, and Bobby Sands eventually in the 80s and all of that. There was all kinds of revolutionary movements that emerged at that time. And the Black Panthers were the black nation of the United States that is a colonized people within U.S. borders, asserting their national rights. And that's what it was. And it was, at that point, Marxism-Leninism, was the ideology that people around the world who were fighting Western imperialism adopted. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that the Black Panthers were, Marxist-Leninists. If you read Mumia Abu-Jamal's book, We Want Freedom, A Life in the Black Panther Party, he talks about how, in a lot of ways, you could argue that more than a Marxist-Leninist party, the Black Panthers were a Malcolmist party. Malcolm X had been killed by the time they were started, but they were very much a Malcolm X party. They were very much inspired by the statements of Malcolm X in the final years of his life after he'd broken with the Nation of Islam. And that in a lot of ways you could say they were more inspired by Malcolm X than by the Third World Marxist-Leninist movement. However, it's important to note that the Black Panthers actually had a particular admiration for North Korea. And that's worth pointing out, that North Korea seemed to be the country they liked the most. That Black Panther newspapers often had articles published by Kim Il-sung, and that the Juche ideology, the particular ideology of North Korea that focused on national liberation and self-reliance, and it really spoke to Huey Newton and the Black Panther Party leadership. It really did. And that there was a particular admiration for, the DPRK among the Black Panther Party, which, that might be shocking to people now. But back in the 1960s and 70s, when the North Koreans had a booming economy, and they were almost like the Las Vegas of the socialist bloc, and people would go to Pyongyang, and it was like a tourist hub. And, compared to South Korea, they actually had a very good economy. South Korea's economy was just kind of getting going at that point, and they still had a very good economy based on Soviet trade. At that point, to admire North Korea was not, a difficult thing. At that point, it wasn't like it is now, where North Korea is, declared to be hell on earth, and they've had all these difficulties. And, North Korea at that point was considered to be kind of one of the more like far left revolutionary countries. The other thing that's worth pointing out is that in 1969, the Black Panthers repudiated left adventurism. And that's very important. Eldridge Cleaver, who was a black nationalist leader. He'd been in prison and wrote a lot of books, and then eventually he joined the Black Panther Party when he got out of prison, and he'd written for Ramparts magazine, which is kind of a left-wing magazine with a lot of shady, it's not clear where their funding came from. It's very shady. It was big in, new left politics. Eldridge Cleaver, he split the Black Panther Party, and he broke. Huey Newton put forward the vision of what he called survival pending revolution, which was all these, food programs. And he put forward the vision of what he called his theory of intercommunalism. I saw somebody asked about it. And he basically argued that the Black Panther Party would eventually lead to the creation of a multinational communist party. He said, the first there'd be the Black Panthers, there'd be the Young Lords, there'd be the Young Patriots for low-income whites, there was the Gay Liberation Network, and eventually the Black Panthers and these revolutionary organizations among different nationalities would lay the basis for a unified communist party to emerge. That was his theory. And what these groups needed to do is needed to set up in neighborhoods and kind of come together to try and carry out his program of what he called survival pending revolution, of building a base in communities. That was Huey Newton. Eldridge Cleaver, on the other hand, advocated left adventurism. He called it urban guerrilla warfare, and he engaged in a series of armed, violent attacks against police officers. And eventually fled the United States. And, there was violence between the two factions in the Black Panther Party. And Huey Newton's line of, we got to feed people, take care of people, build political infrastructure, organize our own communities first, and eventually merge together into forming a revolutionary united front. That theory, that won out, but Eldridge Cleaver engaged in a huge amount of violence and killing, and then eventually Eldridge Cleaver came back to the United States and became a right-winger. He became like a Mormon for a while, and then he was with Reverend Sun Myung Moon, and then he was with different religious groups, and he was right-wing. He was a conservative. I think he was even elected to some local office in California. But that division, that split in 1969, where the Black Panthers were like, are we going to have survival pending revolution and build bases in communities and Huey Newton's theory of intercommunalism? Or are we going to engage in ultra-left adventurous violence? They wrangled with that question and ultimately repudiated the violent, the cop-killing terrorist activities of Eldridge Cleaver and adopted the correct line, which had been the line of the Communist Party of the United States, which had been the line of Eugene Debs and the Wobblies, the correct understanding that socialism is about construction. It's about building. It's about taking care of people. It's about love. It's about community. That it's not about tearing things down. It's not about violence. It's not about killing. It does believe in the right to self-defense, but it rejects ultra-left adventurism. And there you go. And someone's asking about, was it Cleaver? Cleaver made a number of statements about women that are pretty awful. And that's kind of the reputation he became known for. Now, people are saying, did CIA get Huey? I don't know. And people speculate that. I don't quite know the details. I know some people know that, towards the end of his life, Huey Newton apparently had been addicted to drugs. And there's a lot of different theories about how he eventually died. But the Black Panther Party is worth studying. And it's interesting to note, the Weathermen faction of SDS, the Weathermen, the Weather Underground. At first, they were this street fighting, action faction, Revolutionary Youth Movement. Eventually became the terrorist group. The Black Panthers hated them. They hated the Weather Underground. And when they had their days of rage in 1969, the Black Panthers supported a peaceful demonstration on the other side of town in a working class neighborhood. And famously, Fred Hampton, the leader of the Black Panthers that was eventually assassinated, denounced the days of rage and said it was just not a principled, behavior. It was, Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn and, Fred Goldstein, among others, going out in the street and engaging in crazy ultra-leftist activity. And the Black Panther Party rejected that. And the Black Panther Party, when SDS divided, the Students for a Democratic Society divided into three factions. You had the Worker Student Alliance, Progressive Labor Party, you had Revolutionary Youth Movement 1, which was the Weathermen, and then Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, which laid the basis for the new communist movement. Those folks actually, at that point, the Black Panthers supported, they supported Revolutionary Youth Movement 2 and trying to build, people in communities. And I've talked about the history of the, the new communist movement of the NCM. And it just, the time wasn't right. The U.S. working class was just too comfortable at that point. And it was unfortunate what happened with the new communist movement. It's worth studying, but the Maoist movement in the 1970s was very much, it was very much a, it didn't work out ultimately. And I've talked about that in other lives. But what else is